Kestra sat alone in the control room of her small patrol ship and watched the star maps flicker across the screens in front of her, and the silence of deep space had never felt heavier than it did on this night cycle when most of the galaxy seemed to be sleeping peacefully. Her pointed ears twitched slightly as she adjusted the long-range scanners, and her silver hair caught the blue light from the displays and fell in waves down her back, and she wore the standard patrol uniform of the Althari Alliance, which was a simple dark bodysuit with the star emblem on her shoulder. The two dragons sleeping near the navigation console were her only companions on these long patrol routes, and Ember, the larger crimson dragon, was curled into a ball, with his tail wrapped around his snout while his scales glowed faintly in the dim light. And beside him, Frost, the smaller silver dragon, had her wings folded tight against her body, and her breathing created tiny clouds of cold mist in the recycled air. Kestra had been monitoring the emergency channels for 3 full cycles now, and nothing unusual had happened, and she was beginning to think this assignment was just another routine patrol through the outer sectors where nothing ever happened, and where the Alliance sent junior officers to build experience without facing real danger. She reached for her cup of warm tea and took a small sip, and the liquid had gone cold hours ago, but she drank it anyway because it gave her something to do. And the taste reminded her of home on the forest world of Aelthera, where her family still lived in the ancient groves, and where she had promised to return someday when her service was complete. The communication panel suddenly beeped 3 times, and Kestra nearly dropped her cup, and the sound was sharp and urgent, and it cut through the quiet like a blade, and both dragons lifted their heads immediately, and their eyes opened wide and alert. She set down her cup with shaking hands and pulled up the incoming transmission, and the encryption codes showed it was coming from Velros Prime, which was a mining colony about 2 days' travel from her current position, and the message header was marked with the highest priority emergency code she had ever seen in her 5 years of service. Kestra's fingers moved quickly across the controls and decoded the message, and as the words appeared on her screen, her breath caught in her throat and her heart began to pound so hard she could hear it in her ears. The message read that a catastrophic radiation leak had occurred in the main water processing facility at Velros Prime, and the contamination had spread through the entire colony water supply, and more than 200 families were affected, including many children and elderly, and they had less than 1 week before the radiation poisoning would become fatal, and they needed immediate evacuation or emergency water purification systems or both. She read the message twice, and then 3 times, because she could not believe what she was seeing, and her mind raced through everything she knew about radiation, contamination, and water systems, and emergency protocols, and none of it was good news. Ember moved closer to her chair and pressed his warm head against her arm, and she could feel his concern through the bond they shared, and Frost made a soft, worried sound that was somewhere between a chirp and a whine. Kestra immediately began composing an emergency report to Alliance headquarters, and her fingers flew across the keyboard as she detailed the situation and requested immediate assistance. And she knew that headquarters was 7 light years away, and even with the fastest communication relays, her message would take hours to arrive, and the response would take even longer. The Alliance would need to dispatch a full rescue fleet with specialized equipment and medical teams and decontamination units, and that kind of operation took time to organize and coordinate, and she calculated quickly in her head and realized with growing horror that it would take at least 2 weeks for help to arrive from Alliance space. 2 weeks was too long, and the colonists on Velros Prime had maybe 7 days before. People started dying, and children would die first because their smaller bodies could not handle the radiation as long as adults could. She felt helpless and frustrated and angry all at once, because this was exactly the kind of situation that haunted every patrol officer, and the knowledge that people were dying and you could not save them was the worst feeling in the galaxy. Kestra was about to send her emergency report when another signal cut through the communication channels, and this one was different because it did not use Alliance encryption codes, and the energy signature was completely foreign to her systems. Her training told her to be cautious, because unknown vessels in this sector could be pirates or smugglers, or worse, and the Alliance had standing orders to avoid contact with unidentified ships unless absolutely necessary. But something made her pause, and she analyzed the signal more carefully and realized it was also responding to the distress call from Velros. Prime and whoever they had received the same message she had, and they were already moving toward the colony. Kestra pulled up her long-range sensors and tried to identify the approaching vessels, and the computer took several moments to process the data. And when the results appeared on her screen, she felt a cold shock run down her spine. The ships were human, and there were 3 of them traveling in convoy formation, and they were moving fast and pushing their engines hard, and the lead vessel was massive and easily 10 times the size of her small patrol ship. Kestra had never met a human in person, and her knowledge of humanity came mostly from official Alliance briefings and scattered reports from other officers, and what she knew was confusing and sometimes contradictory. Humans were newcomers to the galactic community, and they had only achieved faster than light travel about 40 years ago, and since then they had been spreading through space at a rate that made the older civilizations nervous. Some reports said humans were aggressive and territorial, and that they had fought terrible wars among themselves before finally uniting their planet, and other reports said they were generous and helpful and that they had shared their technology freely with less advanced species. The Alliance had maintained minimal contact with humanity because the Council was divided on whether humans should be welcomed as allies or watched carefully as potential threats, and official policy was to observe and gather information, but avoid deep involvement. Kestra had heard stories about human unpredictability and how they made decisions based on emotion rather than logic, and how they often acted without waiting for proper authority or permission, and these traits made them dangerous in the eyes of many Alliance leaders. She had also heard other stories, though, and these were quieter and less official, and they came from traders and travelers who had encountered humans in remote stations and frontier worlds, and these stories spoke of human kindness and courage, and a strange fierce loyalty to those they considered friends. One story she remembered was about a human merchant ship that had rescued a Vrelian transport when it lost power near a black hole, and the humans had risked their own ship and crew to save complete strangers and had refused any payment afterward. Another story told of human doctors who had stayed on a plague world to treat the sick even after their own government ordered them to evacuate, and they had saved thousands of lives before the cure was finally found. Kestra did not know which stories to believe because they seemed to describe 2 completely different species, and she suspected the truth was probably somewhere in the middle. Now she watched her sensors as the human ships drew closer, and she had to make a decision because she could try to reach Velros Prime first and coordinate with the colony authorities, or she could wait and see what the humans were planning to do. Ember growled softly, and the sound was protective and questioning, and Frost moved to stand beside him, and both dragons looked at Kestra with their intelligent eyes and waited for her to choose. She took a deep breath and opened a communication channel and sent a standard hailing message to the lead human vessel, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were shaking slightly. Within seconds, she received a response, and a human woman's face appeared on her screen, and the woman had dark skin and warm brown eyes and short curled hair, and she wore a blue uniform with captain's insignia on the collar. The human woman smiled, and it seemed genuine and friendly, and she spoke in clear Galactic Standard with only a slight accent. "Hello, and I am Captain Lisa Martinez of the Earth Merchant Fleet, and our vessel Pacific Runner intercepted a distress signal from Velros Prime, and we are responding to provide emergency assistance, and I see you are also en route to the colony, and perhaps we should coordinate our efforts." Kestra stared at the human captain for a moment and processed what she had just heard, because the humans were not asking for permission or waiting for authorization, and they were simply going to help, and they had already committed their ships and crews to a rescue operation for people they had never met. She found her voice and introduced herself, and explained that she was an Alliance patrol officer and that she had also received the distress call, and that Alliance assistance was on the way, but would take time to arrive. Captain Martinez nodded, and her expression became more serious, and she said that time was something the colonists did not have, and that her ship carried water purification systems and medical supplies that could help immediately, and she asked if Kestra would be willing to work with them. Kestra felt torn, because Alliance Regula. The journey to Velros Prime took 6 hours at maximum speed, and Kestra's small patrol ship stayed in formation with the 3 human vessels, and she watched her sensors constantly and tried to understand how these strangers operated and what made them willing to risk so much for people they had never met. Captain Martinez kept an open communication channel the entire time, and Kestra found herself drawn into conversations that ranged from technical discussions about water purification systems to casual questions about her dragons, and the captain seemed genuinely interested in everything and treated Kestra like an equal partner rather than an outsider. Ember and Frost had both warmed to the situation quickly, and the dragons seemed to sense that the humans meant no harm, and Frost even performed a playful loop near the viewport when one of the human crew members commented on how beautiful she looked, and Ember watched the human ships with curious eyes and occasionally made rumbling sounds that Kestra recognized as approval. Lisa Martinez explained that she had grown up on a water reclamation station orbiting Mars and had spent her entire career working in resource distribution and emergency supply chains, and she spoke about water the way Kestra's people spoke about forests, and with reverence and understanding of how precious it was. The captain told stories about her crew, and Kestra learned that the Pacific Runner carried 43 people from 12 different Earth nations, and they had been together for 3 years and functioned like a close family. And the 2 escort frigates were crewed by volunteers from the merchant fleet who had joined the convoy specifically to help with emergencies. Kestra asked why they responded so quickly without waiting for authorization or payment, and Lisa's answer was simple and direct. And she said that when someone sends a distress signal, the only moral response is to help, and that waiting for permission, while people died, was not something she could live with. The human captain asked detailed questions about Velros Prime, and Kestra shared everything she knew about the colony layout and the species that lived there and the local government structure, and Lisa took careful notes and began forming plans for how to deploy her equipment most effectively. As they drew closer to Velros Prime, Kestra received updated reports from the colony, and the situation had deteriorated faster than anyone predicted, and 17 colonists were already showing severe symptoms of radiation poisoning, and the colony's medical facility was overwhelmed and running out of basic supplies. She relayed this information to Captain Martinez and watched the human woman's face tighten with concern, and Lisa immediately called a meeting with her department heads, and Kestra was included in the video conference. The human crew worked with impressive efficiency, and the chief medical officer was a woman named Paula Griffin, who had gray hair and kind eyes, and she outlined what supplies they could provide and what treatments would be most effective. And the chief engineer was a young man named Carlos Webb, who explained how quickly they could set up the water purification systems and what power sources they would need. Kestra contributed what she knew about the colony's infrastructure and helped identify the best landing zones and suggested which local officials they should contact first, and the humans listened carefully to her input and adjusted their plans based on her knowledge. What struck Kestra most was how the humans worked together, and there was no hierarchy based on species or homeworld, because they treated each other with respect and they disagreed openly, but never with anger, and they made decisions quickly through consensus rather than waiting for orders from above. Lisa asked Kestra if her dragons could help with reconnaissance and explained that having aerial support would make the operation safer and more efficient, and Kestra felt a surge of pride because no one had ever asked Ember and Frost to participate in something important before. She agreed immediately and explained that both dragons had excellent vision and could detect temperature changes and radiation signatures that normal scanners might miss, and Ember raised his head and snorted small flames in what Kestra recognized as excitement, and Frost chirped happily. The human crew seemed delighted by this, and Carlos mentioned that he had always wanted to meet a real dragon, and Paula asked if the dragons needed any special accommodations or food, and their genuine interest in her companion's well-being touched something deep in Kestra's heart as they entered orbit around Velros Prime. Kestra got her first clear view of the mining colony, and it was built into the side of a massive asteroid and consisted of interconnected domes and tunnels that housed the workers and their families, and the main water processing facility was located in the largest central dome, and that was where the radiation leak had occurred. The colony's administrator was a Zelian named Torvak, and he appeared on the communication screen looking exhausted and desperate, and his scaled face showed the strain of 3 days without sleep. and he begged them to hurry because children were getting sicker by the hour. Captain Martinez assured him that help was arriving and asked for landing clearance and permission to deploy her teams, and Torvak granted everything immediately and provided access codes to all colony systems and told them to do whatever was necessary. The Pacific runner was too large to land, so Lisa anchored the ship in high orbit and began launching shuttles, loaded with equipment and personnel, and the two escort frigates took up defensive positions and sent down their own support teams, and Kestra guided her patrol ship down to the main landing pad with Ember and Frost alert and ready when the cargo ramp of the first human shuttle opened. Kestra watched dozens of crew members pour out wearing protective suits and carrying cases of supplies, and they moved with purpose and discipline and immediately began setting up a command center in the colony's main plaza. Captain Martinez was among the first to disembark, and she walked directly to Administrator Torvak and shook his hand in the human gesture of greeting and spoke words of reassurance that seemed to lift some of the weight from the administrator's shoulders. Kestra landed nearby and opened her ship's hatch, and Ember bounded out first and stretched his wings, and Frost followed more cautiously, and both dragons attracted immediate attention from the colonists who had gathered to watch, and children pointed and whispered, and for a moment their fear seemed to lift. Lisa approached Kestra and smiled warmly and thanked her for guiding them in safely, and then she introduced Kestra to her senior crew, and they all greeted her with the same easy friendliness, and Paula even gave her a quick hug, which surprised Kestra because physical contact was not common in formal alliance interactions. The next few hours became a blur of constant activity, and Kestra worked alongside the human teams and helped coordinate with colony officials and translated between different species. Because she spoke 7 languages and watched in amazement as the humans transformed chaos into organized efficiency, Carlos and his engineering team set up 3 massive water purification units in record time, and they worked faster than Kestra thought possible, and they improvised solutions when they encountered unexpected problems, and they never complained even when the work was hard. And Dirty Paula established a medical center in the colony school building and began treating the sickest patients. And she worked with quiet competence and held frightened children's hands and spoke to worried parents in a calm voice that somehow transcended language barriers. Ember and Frost proved invaluable just as Kestra had promised, and they flew reconnaissance patterns over the colony and identified radiation hotspots that the scanners had missed, and they helped evacuate families from the most contaminated sectors by carrying supplies and guiding people to safety. The dragons became heroes to the colony children, and Frost especially seemed to enjoy the attention, and she would hover near groups of young ones and let them touch her silver scales, and Ember maintained his dignified composure, but Kestra could sense his pleasure at being useful. Captain Martinez was everywhere at once, and she coordinated supply distribution and consulted with medical staff and met with colony leadership and checked on her crew, and still found time to kneel beside sick children and offer comfort. Kestra watched one particular moment that stayed with her, and it happened when a small Vrelian child, no more than 4 years old, was crying in fear because the medical scans were loud and frightening, and Paula could not calm the child despite her best efforts. Lisa noticed and walked over and sat down beside the child and began singing softly, and the song was in a human language Kestra did not recognize, and the melody was simple and soothing, and the captain's voice was not particularly beautiful, but it was warm and genuine. The child stopped crying and listened, and then reached out and took Lisa's hand, and the captain kept singing while Paula completed the medical scan, and when it was over, the child smiled at Lisa and said something in broken galactic standard that meant, "Thank you." Kestra felt her eyes burn with unexpected tears, because she realized she was witnessing something rare and precious, and these humans were not helping because they expected rewards or recognition, and they were helping because it was simply who they were. The second day on Velros Prime began before the sun rose over the asteroid's artificial horizon, and Kestra had barely slept 3 hours when alarms pulled her from her bunk, and she stumbled into the command center to find Captain Martinez already. The reviewing reports and drinking something dark and steaming from a metal cup. Lisa looked up and offered a tired smile and explained that the contamination had spread to a secondary water tank during the night, and another 100 families were now at risk, and they needed to expand the purification operations immediately. and Kestra felt her stomach drop, because they were already working at maximum capacity. But the human captain did not seem discouraged, and she simply adjusted her plans and called her team leaders, and within 20 minutes they had mobilized additional equipment and personnel. And Kestra marveled at how quickly humans adapted to changing circumstances. Ember and Frost had slept curled together near the landing pad, and when Kestra went outside to brief them about the new situation, both dragons were alert and ready, despite having flown reconnaissance missions until late into the previous night, and their dedication reminded her why she loved them so fiercely. The morning brought new challenges that tested everyone's limits, and one of the purification units broke down due to mineral buildup in the filters, and Carlos and his team worked frantically to repair it, while families waited in line for clean water, and the pressure mounted with each passing minute. Kestra watched Carlos tear apart the unit with his bare hands, and his fingers were bleeding from sharp metal edges, but he did not stop, and he muttered constantly in what she assumed was Spanish. And when one of his crew members tried to get him to take a break, he just shook his head and kept working. The unit was back online within 2 hours, and Carlos had fixed it using spare parts from completely different systems and some creative engineering that probably violated a dozen safety regulations. And when Administrator Torvak praised his work, Carlos just shrugged and said that desperate times called for flexible thinking. Paula's medical team faced their own crisis when 3 elderly patients went into critical condition simultaneously, and the colony's medical facility did not have enough advanced equipment to treat all 3 at once. And Kestra heard Paula speaking urgently into her communication device and requesting emergency supplies from the Pacific Runner. Within 30 minutes, a shuttle arrived carrying additional medical equipment and 2 more doctors who had been resting on the ship, and they integrated seamlessly into the existing team, and all 3 patients were stabilized by midday, and their families wept with relief and gratitude. Kestra spent most of the day coordinating between different groups and translating complicated technical instructions and helping resolve disputes over resource distribution. And she discovered that crisis management required not just technical skill, but also patience and empathy and the ability to make difficult decisions quickly. She also discovered that humans had an unusual approach to hierarchy, because Captain Martinez encouraged everyone to speak up with ideas and suggestions regardless of their rank or position, and several times Kestra watched junior crew members propose solutions that the captain immediately implemented. This was very different from Alliance protocols, where decisions flowed down from command and subordinates were expected to follow orders without question. And Kestra found herself wondering if the human approach might actually be more effective in emergency situations where conditions changed rapidly. During a brief lunch break, Kestra sat with several human crew members, and they shared food from their rations, and someone gave her something called a protein bar that tasted like compressed sawdust but provided energy, and they talked casually about their lives and families back on Earth. A young woman named Amy Chen told stories about growing up in Singapore and learning to dive in the South China Sea, and she showed Kestra pictures on her datapad of colorful fish and coral reefs and explained that Earth's oceans were precious and needed protection, just like the water here on Velros Prime. An older man named Victor Ross talked about his grandchildren and how he had joined the merchant fleet after retiring from teaching because he wanted to see the galaxy and make a difference, and his eyes sparkled when he described his grandson's reaction to learning that Grandpa worked on a real spaceship. These conversations helped Kestra understand something important about humans, because they carried their homes and families with them in their hearts, and their motivation for helping strangers came from remembering the people they loved and wanting others to experience that same care and protection. Ember interrupted lunch by landing heavily in the plaza and creating a small dust cloud, and the dragon looked agitated and made urgent clicking sounds, and Kestra immediately stood because she recognized his warning signals. Through their bond, she felt what Ember had discovered during his patrol, and there was a structural weakness in one of the dome seals near the contaminated processing facility, and if it failed, the radiation would spread into the residential sectors and hundreds more people would be exposed. She ran to find Captain Martinez and explained the situation, and Lisa immediately grasped the severity and gathered Carlos and his engineering team, and they followed Ember to the location and Kestra ran alongside them while Frost flew overhead, keeping watch when they reached the damaged seal. Carlos examined it carefully and his expression grew dark, and he explained that the seal was failing because radiation had weakened the bonding material, and it would collapse within hours and possibly sooner, and they needed to evacuate everyone in the surrounding sectors. Immediately, Administrator Torvak argued that evacuation would cause panic and suggested they try to repair the seal first, but Captain Martinez firmly disagreed and said that protecting lives was more important than preventing fear, and she ordered the evacuation to begin at once. Kestra helped coordinate the evacuation and moved through the residential corridors with other volunteers and knocked on doors and explained the danger and helped families gather essential belongings and children clutched toys and parents carried babies, and everyone moved with urgency, but not panic, because the calm voices of the human crew seemed to steady them. Frost guided groups of evacuees to safe zones, and the Silver Dragon flew slowly enough that even the elderly could follow, and children pointed at her and seemed less afraid when they had something beautiful to focus on. Besides their fear, Carlos and his team worked on the seal, while the evacuation continued, and they could not repair it permanently, but they managed to reinforce it enough to buy time. And Carlos worked until his hands were shaking from exhaustion, and his protective suit was covered in radioactive dust. Paula insisted on scanning Carlos and several other engineers who had been exposed to higher radiation levels, and she gave them medication to help their bodies process the contamination and scolded them gently for taking such risks. And Carlos laughed and said that some things were worth the risk. By evening, the evacuation was complete, and the reinforced seal was holding and no one had been injured, and Kestra felt exhausted but also strangely energized, because they had faced a crisis and overcome it through cooperation and quick thinking. She found Captain Martinez standing alone on an observation platform looking out at the colony, and the human woman looked tired beyond words, and Kestra approached quietly and stood beside her in comfortable silence. Lisa finally spoke and said that days like this reminded her why she had chosen this life. And despite the danger and exhaustion, there was something deeply satisfying about making a real difference and knowing that her actions saved lives. Kestra agreed and added that she had learned more in 2 days working with humans than she had in 5 years of Alliance patrol duty. And Lisa smiled and said that crisis had a way of teaching lessons that no classroom could match. They stood together, watching Ember and Frost play in the artificial twilight, and the dragons chased each other in lazy circles, and their movements were graceful and joyful, despite their exhaustion. And Kestra thought about how much had changed since she first received the distress signal. She had been trained to see humans as unpredictable and potentially dangerous. But what she discovered instead was that humans were driven by a deep sense of responsibility to others, and they possessed remarkable courage and creativity when facing challenges, and most importantly, they seemed to genuinely care about the well-being of beings they had never met before. Captain Martinez turned to her and asked if she regretted working with them instead of waiting for Alliance approval, and Kestra answered honestly and said that she would make the same choice again without hesitation, because watching people die while help sat idle was something she could never accept. Lisa nodded and said that was the difference between following rules and doing what was right, and sometimes those things aligned. But when they did not, a person had to choose between their conscience and their comfort, and she was glad Kestra had chosen conscience. As they walked back to the command center together, Kestra realized that she had found something unexpected on this mission, and she had found friends among the stars and allies who shared her values and a new understanding of what it meant to serve others. The third day brought unexpected progress, and hope began to replace fear throughout the colony, and Kestra woke to find Captain Martinez celebrating with her crew, because overnight testing showed that the radiation levels in the main water supply had dropped below dangerous thresholds and families could soon return to their homes. Paula reported that all the critical patients had stabilized and were showing signs of recovery, and no new cases of severe radiation poisoning had appeared in over 24 hours, and children who had been weak and sick just days ago were now playing in the temporary shelters, and their laughter echoed through the corridors. Ember and Frost sensed the shift in mood, and both dragons became more playful and energetic, and Frost performed aerial displays that delighted the colony children, and Ember allowed youngsters to touch his scales and take pictures with him, and Kestra had never seen her companions so content. Administrator Torvak called a meeting with all the department heads, and Captain Martinez and Kestra attended, and the administrator's exhaustion had been replaced with gratitude and relief, and he struggled to find words adequate to express what the human intervention had meant to his people. Lisa listened politely and then redirected the praise to her crew and to Kestra, and to the colony workers who had supported the operation, and she insisted that success had come from cooperation rather than any single group's efforts, and her humility impressed everyone in the room. Torvak raised the question that Kestra had been dreading, and he asked what payment the humans expected for their services and equipment and supplies, and he explained that the colony had limited funds, but would arrange whatever compensation was fair and reasonable. Captain Martinez shook her head and said that no payment was necessary, and the Pacific Runner and its escort vessels had simply responded to a distress call, as any decent being should, and she asked only that if Torvak ever encountered others in need, he would offer the same help. The room fell silent, and Torvak stared at the human captain as if unable to believe what he had heard, and he asked again about compensation, and mentioned fuel costs and equipment wear and crew time, and surely there must be some price. Lisa remained firm, and explained that her ship was already contracted for a supply run to the Kepler stations, and this detour had added only 2 days to their schedule, and the equipment they had used was standard emergency gear that would be replaced at no significant cost. And helping people was not a transaction, but a moral obligation. Kestra watched the other officials exchange glances, and she knew they were thinking what she had thought when she first met the humans, and that beings this generous and selfless were either foolish or operating with motives that were not immediately obvious. But Kestra had spent 3 days working alongside these humans, and she had seen their actions when no one was watching, and she had witnessed their exhaustion and their sacrifices, and she knew their kindness was genuine and uncomplicated by hidden agendas. Torvak finally accepted Lisa's refusal of payment, and he thanked her with tears in his eyes and promised that Velros Prime would remember what humanity had done, and that the story would spread throughout the sector. The meeting ended, and Kestra followed Captain Martinez outside and found the human woman standing in the plaza watching her crew pack equipment and prepare for departure, and there was something melancholy in her expression. Kestra asked if something was wrong, and Lisa smiled sadly and said that this was always the hardest part, because they had to leave before seeing the full recovery, and before knowing if their work would have lasting impact, and she wished she could stay longer. But duty called elsewhere. They walked together through the colony, and everywhere they went, people stopped to thank them, and parents introduced their healthy children, and elderly residents offered blessings in a dozen different languages, and the gratitude was overwhelming and beautiful. A small Vrelian girl ran up to Captain Martinez and handed her a drawing, and it showed a human figure standing next to dragons and stars, and the word heroes was written in careful childish letters at the bottom, and Lisa knelt down and hugged the child and promised to keep the drawing forever. Carlos finished the final repairs on the water processing facility and reported that the system was running better than it had before the accident, and he had implemented several improvements that would prevent similar failures in the future, and he refused to take credit and said he had just done his job. Paula conducted final medical checks on all the patients who had been seriously ill and declared that every single one would make full recovery, and she left detailed treatment plans with the colony doctors and made them promise to contact her if any complications arose, and she gave them her personal communication code. The human crew worked steadily throughout the day, completing last-minute tasks and saying goodbyes, and Kestra noticed how many friendships had formed in just 3 days, and she saw crew members exchanging contact information with colonists and promising to stay in touch. Ami Chen spent an hour teaching colony children a game from Earth involving hand clapping and singing, and the children picked it up quickly, and their joy was infectious, and Amy wiped tears from her eyes as she hugged them. Goodbye. Victor Ross had found another teacher among the colonists, and they had spent hours discussing education philosophy and sharing stories about their students, and when they parted, Victor left behind a data chip containing hundreds of Earth teaching resources and lesson plans. As evening approached, the human ships prepared to depart, and Kestra felt an unexpected sadness because these 3 days had changed her in ways she was still trying to understand, and saying goodbye to people who had become friends was harder than she had anticipated, Captain Martinez invited Kestra aboard the Pacific Runner for a final meal, and Kestra brought Ember and Frost and the dragons squeezed into the ship's dining area, and the crew made room for them with good-natured laughter. The meal was simple but delicious, and humans apparently believed that food tasted better when shared with friends, and the conversation flowed easily and included jokes and stories and gentle teasing, and Kestra felt completely accepted, despite being the only non-human present. After dinner, Lisa gave Kestra a tour of the Pacific Runner and showed her the water purification systems and the medical bay and the living quarters where crew members had decorated their spaces with personal items and photos and mementos from a dozen worlds. They ended up in the observation lounge and stood before the large windows watching Velros Prime slowly rotate below, and the colony lights twinkled like stars, and Lisa said that moments like this made all the hardship worthwhile. Kestra asked what the captain meant, and Lisa explained that the universe was vast and often cruel, and people suffered through no fault of their own, and sometimes it felt overwhelming and impossible to make a real difference. But then came moments like Velros Prime, where a small group of people working together could save hundreds of lives, and those moments proved that individual actions mattered, and that choosing to help rather than ignore suffering was always the right choice. She added that humanity had learned terrible lessons throughout their history, and they had experienced wars and famines and plagues and extinctions, and those experiences had taught them the value of compassion and cooperation, and the importance of protecting the vulnerable. Kestra listened carefully, and said that the Alliance had always viewed human emotion as a weakness and a source of unpredictability that made humans difficult to work with and understand. Lisa laughed and agreed that humans were definitely emotional and unpredictable, but suggested that those qualities were not weaknesses but sources of strength, because emotion created empathy, and empathy drove people to care about strangers, and unpredictability meant humans could adapt and improvise when rigid plans failed. Kestra realized that the captain was right, and the very traits that made Alliance leaders nervous about humanity were the same traits that had saved Velros Prime, and perhaps the galaxy needed more unpredictability and more emotion and more beings willing to break rules when following that meant letting people die. They returned to the landing pad where the crew was completing final preparations, and Ember and Frost stood nearby, and both dragons looked sad to see their new friends leaving, and Frost made soft, mournful sounds. Captain Martinez approached Kestra and handed her a small device and explained that it was a communication beacon, and if Kestra ever needed help or just wanted to talk, she could activate it, and the Pacific Runner would receive the signal no matter where they were in the galaxy. Kestra accepted the gift and felt her throat tighten with emotion, and she tried to thank Lisa properly, but words seemed inadequate, and the captain understood and simply pulled her into a brief hug. Lisa then surprised everyone by approaching Ember and Frost and thanking them formally for their service and courage, and she touched each dragon gently on the snout, and both dragons rumbled with pleasure, and Ember even bowed his head slightly in respect. The human crew boarded their shuttles and lifted off in precise formation, and Kestra stood with Administrator Torvak and hundreds of colonists and watched the ships rise into the dark sky and eventually disappear among the stars. Kestra spent 2 full days composing her report to Alliance headquarters, and every word had to be chosen carefully because she knew that what she wrote would influence how the Alliance viewed humanity for years to come, and the responsibility weighed heavily on her shoulders. Ember and Frost stayed close while she worked, and the dragons seemed to understand the importance of what she was doing, and they kept quiet except for occasional reassuring sounds when her frustration became visible. Induent wrote about the technical aspects first and detailed the water purification operations and the medical treatments and the structural repairs, and the numbers were impressive because the human crew had accomplished in 4 days what would have taken an Alliance fleet 2 weeks or more. But numbers alone could not capture what had really happened at Velros Prime, and Kestra struggled to find words that would convey the human spirit and their unwavering commitment to helping strangers and their refusal to calculate cost before offering aid. She wrote about Captain Martinez kneeling beside frightened children and Carlos working until his hands bled and Paula treating patients with gentle compassion, regardless of their species, and she wrote about how the entire crew had functioned as one united family. despite coming from different nations and backgrounds. Kestra included her observations about human decision-making and how they valued input from all levels and adapted quickly to changing circumstances, and she argued that these qualities made them exceptional crisis responders and potentially valuable allies. She also addressed the concerns that Alliance leadership would inevitably raise, and she acknowledged that humans were emotional and unpredictable, and sometimes acted without proper authorization. But she explained that these same traits had saved 200 families who would have died while waiting for official protocols to be followed. The hardest part was writing her recommendation, and Kestra knew that some council members would dismiss her report as the naive impressions of a junior officer who had been manipulated by clever humans, and they would argue that humanity's generosity was a calculated strategy to gain influence. But Kestra had seen too much to doubt what she knew in her heart, and she wrote clearly and firmly that humanity deserved full alliance partnership, and that any species capable of such selfless action should be welcomed and supported rather than viewed with suspicion. She transmitted the report through official channels and then sent a personal copy directly to her commanding officer with a note explaining that she was willing to testify before the council, if necessary, and she would stake her career on the accuracy of her observations. The response came faster than expected, and within 3 days, Kestra received orders to return to Alliance headquarters for debriefing, and the tone of the message was neutral, but she sensed tension beneath the formal language. She said goodbye to Administrator Torvak, who had become a friend during her extended stay on Velros Prime, and he gave her a gift for Captain Martinez, and it was a crystal sculpture depicting dragons and humans standing together, and he asked her to deliver it personally if possible. The journey back to Alliance space took 8 days, and Kestra spent the time preparing for questions she knew would come, and rehearsing answers and trying to anticipate every objection the council might raise. Ember and Frost seemed nervous during the trip, and they picked up on her anxiety and stayed closer than usual, and she talked to them often and explained what was happening and why it mattered. When she arrived at Alliance headquarters, she was immediately summoned to the council chambers, and she walked through the grand corridors feeling very small and very young, and very aware that she was about to challenge beings who had centuries of experience. The council chamber was circular and tiered and filled with representatives from 24 species, and they sat in judgment looking down at her, and their expressions ranged from curiosity to skepticism to outright hostility. The head counselor was a Zenthari elder named Vexen, who had held his position for 40 years, and he began by thanking Kestra for her service and acknowledging the successful outcome at Velros Prime. And then his tone shifted and became sharp. He questioned why she had cooperated with non-alliance vessels without authorization, and why she had allowed humans to take control of the operation, and whether she had considered the political implications of her actions. Kestra answered honestly and said that she had acted to save lives, and that waiting for authorization would have resulted in deaths, and that the humans had not taken control, but rather offered assistance, that she had accepted. Vexen pressed harder and suggested that she had been deceived by human manipulation, and that their generosity was too convenient to be genuine, and that perhaps they had other motives for establishing presence in that sector. Kestra felt anger rise in her chest, and she took a breath and spoke more firmly than she had ever spoken to a superior officer, and she said that she had spent 4 days observing the humans closely and had seen their exhaustion and their sacrifices and their genuine care for beings they had never met. She described Captain Martinez, refusing payment, and Carlos working with bleeding hands, and Paula holding sick children, and Amy teaching games to traumatized youngsters, and she challenged the council to explain what hidden motive could justify such actions. Another counselor, named Rethia, spoke up, and her voice was gentler, and she asked what Kestra believed humanity wanted from the Alliance, and what their long-term goals might be. Kestra considered the question carefully and answered that she believed humans simply wanted to be accepted as equals and to participate in galactic society, and to help where they could, and that their goals seemed no different from any other species seeking connection and purpose. She added that humanity had survived terrible hardships on their homeworld and had learned the value of cooperation and compassion, and they brought those lessons with them into space, and the galaxy would be better for welcoming them rather than keeping them at distance. Vexen interrupted and said that emotional species were dangerous because they acted impulsively and without proper consideration, and that humanity's youth made them unpredictable and potentially destabilizing. Kestra felt something shift inside her, and she realized she was tired of hearing the same objections and tired of watching fear prevent progress. And she spoke with conviction that surprised even herself. She said that perhaps the problem was not that humans were too emotional, but that other species had become too cautious and too willing to hide behind protocols while people suffered. And she said that watching children die because proper authorization took too long was not wisdom, but cowardice. The chamber erupted in angry voices, and several counselors demanded she apologize for her disrespect, and Vexen called for order, and his face showed disapproval and shock. But Rethia raised her hand and silence fell, and she said that perhaps the young officer had a point, and that the alliance had grown comfortable and complacent, and maybe they needed to remember that rules existed to serve people, not the other way around. She proposed that the council send an official delegation to meet with human leadership and establish formal relations and evaluate humanity's application for alliance membership based on merit rather than prejudice. The debate lasted for hours, and Kestra was eventually dismissed and told to wait for the council's decision, and she left the chamber exhausted and uncertain whether she had helped or hurt humanity's cause. 3 days later, she received the verdict, and the council had voted to establish formal diplomatic contact with humanity and to send Rethia as chief ambassador, and Kestra was assigned to the delegation as a liaison officer because of her experience working with humans. The news spread quickly through Alliance space, and reactions were mixed, and some praised the decision as progressive, while others condemned it as dangerous, and Kestra received dozens of messages, both supportive and critical. But one message stood out, and it came from Captain Martinez, who had somehow heard about the council meeting, and she thanked Kestra for standing up for humanity and said that courage came in many forms, and speaking truth to power was one of the most difficult and most important. Lisa included an update about the Pacific Runner and said they had responded to 2 more emergency calls since leaving Velros Prime, and the crew sent their regards to Kestra and to Ember and Frost. Kestra replied immediately and told Lisa about the delegation and suggested they arrange a formal meeting, and she included a photo of the crystal sculpture from Administrator Torvak over the following weeks. Kestra helped prepare for the diplomatic mission and studied human culture and history and learned about their art and music and literature, and she discovered a species that was endlessly complex and contradictory and fascinating. She learned about human wars and wondered how beings capable of such violence could also show such compassion. And she learned about human philosophy and was moved by their constant questioning and seeking of meaning. Ember and Frost accompanied her everywhere and had become minor celebrities after word spread about their role at Velros Prime, and young officers asked to meet them, and children sent drawings. The day finally came when the delegation departed for Earth, and Kestra stood on the bridge of the ambassador's ship and watched the blue and green planet grow larger in the viewport, and she felt excitement and nervousness in equal measure.